Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture. David Hughes is a registered landscape architect and owner of Weatherwood Design LLC, a business specializing in native plant-based garden design and ecological natural habitat conservation. For 35 years, he's designed and implemented practices that combine human needs with nature's needs, helping both achieve a functioning and balanced state. So at this point, I will turn things over to David to get us started. Hi, David.
Hi. Thank you again, Amy, for having me on with your community of garden lovers. And I think this will be really exciting. This is only the second time this presentation's been given about our property. It's relatively new to the public. I will start. So the Weatherwood Ridge Reserve is a 4-acre property in a more rural part of Tinicum, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That's the Tinicum that's far north of Philadelphia, not the one down by the Philadelphia airport. And the property is located in an area that is has residential properties around, but many of the residential properties are pretty large properties. Some can be 10 to 50 acres in our general area. And this particular property is 4 acres. It's almost exactly square, and it happens to be across the street from a very large county park, the Tohickon Valley Park. And as we go through the presentation, I will talk about various habitats that are within the property, like the Healing Woods and the Owl's Nest Woods, and why they have those names. So as I was saying, this is Bucks County, and the image you're seeing on the screen is a large flat ridge that is between the Delaware River here, and this is New Jersey, state of New Jersey across the way, and this is the Tohickon Valley Creek here. We are looking south. The drone is stationed right above our property, and we're looking south towards the town of Point Pleasant here. And if you go further down, this is New Hope, Pennsylvania. And if you were to look off in the horizon up here, if you could see it on a clear day, you would see the skyscrapers in Philadelphia. The property has 2 different types of geology on it. There is the Stockton Formation, which is like a red shale, and it is a highly erodible type of soils that come from the red shale. They're very rocky with a lot of pebbles and things embedded in the soils. And then the other portion of the property has Lockatong Formation, which is a harder shale or argillite, and it tends to be gray-black. And underneath the Lockatong Formation is actually a perched water table because of a fragipan that is developed underneath the soils here. And that portion of the property is poorly drained. So here you can see a kind of overall aerial view of where the Lockatong, this is the poorly drained in the pink area, and the red shales are in the yellow area. And so they kind of have this weird pattern on the property where this central hedgerow has a kind of peninsula of the gray shale. We are also in the property kind of folds and bends partially towards the Delaware River and partially towards the Tohickon Creek. But, essentially you could consider us at the lower end of the Tohickon Valley watershed, and the Delaware watershed is the other portion of the property where it flows to. Our forest type is an oak hickory forest type. There happens to be 4 types of native oaks to the property: white oak, red oak, black oak, and pin oak. And there's a number of hickories that are also common on the property: shagbark hickory, pignut hickory, and bitternut hickory. The understory is dominated by hop hornbeams in the driest section of the property, and where it's a little wetter, you have black haw viburnums and white dogwood, and a little bit of persimmon. Oops. So when I purchased the property back in 2014, this is what the woodlands looked like. We have a very high deer population in this part of Bucks County. And so the canopy trees were intact and reasonably healthy, but the ground plane was pretty bare. And so the few areas that you see here, this is Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica, and a lot of open forest floor. So the property is basically broken down into some wooded areas and some open areas. And so the open areas were mowed lawn, and I'll show you some of that in the later part. There's a little section we call Owl's Nest Woods, because in the first few years we were finding screech owls nesting in that portion of the property. Owl's Nest Woods was heavily invaded by invasive plants, whereas Healing Woods had very little invasive plants in it. Probably mostly because this is so dry and rocky over in this section that it was not easy to have any types of plants invade in that area. Over time, we've developed an area that has ponds in it, and we have a shrubland area along the back of the property. I've seeded a wet meadow in this portion of the property, and other portions we've actually allowed the lawn to regrow and see what was coming up, and started to edit out some of the non-native plants and kind of let the native plants prosper. Cultural context. So this property, based upon some of the plants that have shown up on their own, leads us to believe that it was likely never plowed. While there was agricultural activity all around us, this property likely was just pastured for small animals, maybe sheep, maybe goats, something like that. And so two of the plants that have shown up are pretty unique plants. One is this swamp lousewort, which on the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program is a relatively rare plant in Pennsylvania. And as you go towards the Northeast, as you go towards the upper Midwest, it's much more common. When I was doing a little research on the Natural Heritage Program website, it suggested there were only 10 populations of this plant in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's pretty awesome to see that plant show up in the last couple of years. Before that, we were seeing some of these ragged fringed orchids. Again, a less common type of orchid was showing up randomly on the property. And neither one of these plants can tolerate a lot of disturbance, particularly in the soil plane. So that's why they are here, and tells us a lot about what did or did not happen on the property. The other evidence to the cultural history of the site is in the back portion of the property, there's a white oak that has rebar, and here, or not rebar, barbed wire in the tree. And here you can see the tree is actually grown around some of the rebar, or barbed wire, excuse me. Barbed wire was invented in 1867 here in the United States. And this particular type of barbed wire is called buckthorn, and it was patented in 1881. So you can do a little math and kind of determine that this oak hickory woods that I have is at least 100 years old, because this tree, while it's not very large, it's maybe 14 inches in diameter. White oaks are very slow growing. But we know if this barbed wire was used in the late 1800s, likely this woodland is over 100 years old. There are also several areas of stone walls along the property. It borders three sides of the property, and there's a stone wall down the center section as well. These areas were divided up, again, likely for small animals to be pastured on the property. Little tidbits about the house. It was built in 1859, which was about the peak of the Pennsylvania Canal system was running along the Delaware River. And so the house even has a more specific tie to the Delaware River and the canal system, and that we have learned through historical architects that the plank siding that is on the house is plank logs, and they were actually used in rafts that were floated down the Delaware River for lumber to be placed on. And this sign here where these two holes are in the boards show where a hickory wicket was put into the flat plank and then used to tie down the logs to the raft. Post me purchasing the property, we've done a number of things. So I bought it in June of 2014. Early winter of 2014-15, I installed a deer fence system around the property, all 4 acres. In the summer of 2015, I stopped mowing a lot of the property to see what was going to come in on its own and dug the first natural pond area that was on the property. Excuse me. In 2015, I also seeded a wet meadow area, about 3/4 of an acre. Later on, we started to have to deal with the removal of ash trees. So that was a big impact on the property. There's a small green roof was completed on a shed in 2017. We started to do a large removal of Japanese honeysuckle from the property in 2019, and some other things that have happened since then. We took down the last untreated white ash in June of last year. So this presentation really is about the way in which the property has changed over time, the waves of kind of disturbance that have happened to it. And then I'm going to get into the second portion of it where we'll talk about the way in which we have looked at healing and rejuvenated the property and the native habitats that are on it. So I'm going to go through a number of events that have happened to the property, and you can see them here. So one of the first things that happened to all of our region, or nearly all of our region, in the late 1800s, much of the forested areas were cut to make small subsistent farming units for families living on the east coast of the mid-Atlantic. So this is a diorama that was is available to see up at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. And they have a number of these, and they're really well done. And they describe how forests have changed from pre-Columbian settlement all the way to current history of how our forests have evolved over time, particularly with our cultural inputs. As I was mentioning, all of us were involved with having problems with emerald ash borer. And so over the last few years, I've had to take out 82 ash trees, and many of them we use the special spider lift to remove them carefully so that we weren't damaging a lot of native plant material that was still surviving around these trees. And here you can see some of the logs taken down. Fortunately, a lot of the ash trees were in the edges of the woods, so I didn't have to go into the woods to take them out, or in the hedgerows where they could be a little more easily removed. A lot of the logs I had milled, brought in a portable sawmill, and the framing to this composting toilet is actually from the ash trees that were harvested on the property. Also, an impact on the property, actually before I bought it, was Hurricane Sandy in October of 2012. And the reason why I know that Sandy did so much damage on this property is because the way the trees were felled on the property, they suggest a pattern that you can see in hurricane type storms versus thunderstorms that also happen in our area. Basically, the trees, well, a hurricane force winds are counterclockwise. And so if you look on here, we're basically looking north on the property, and all of the trees, and they happen to be red oak trees, were the ones that were mostly impacted by the winds, are all fell basically to the southwest. The one exception here is this ash tree that fell out into the open later on. Here's a close-up, and you can see all of these red oaks that were laid down all in the same pattern in the same storm. Why the red oaks? I think the reason is because red oaks in this particular type of landscape, with all the rocks in the soils, do not create deep root systems. They're more shallow in comparison to the white oaks and black oaks that were in this woodland area. So here you can see the woods as they were when I bought them. And without the deer fencing, you can see that many areas of the forest floor are stripped due to the overpopulation of deer. One of the few plants that you could see regularly in the spring is this anemone, wood anemone. There are many patches of that, and that's basically a low-growing spring ephemeral that is really below where the deer can browse easily. As mentioned before, there was a lot of lawn on the property, and lawn tends to be in our landscapes in the United States to be the default factor for how we manage landscapes. So if we're not sure how to do things, we just typically mow the lawn as a landscape maintenance practice. Here, when I bought the property, this green circled area was everything that was in lawn when I bought it. I suspect the homeowner that owned it before me was spending about 4 hours with a modest-sized mower mowing the lawn. I'm now down to about an hour and 20 minutes of mowing, and most of what I'm mowing are paths to get to different places on the property. There are a number of invasive plants on the property, which my wife and I diligently have been working through to get rid of. We're not all the way there yet. And there will be some invasive plants like Japanese stilt grass that we may never get rid of on the property. But we targeted a lot of the woody plants initially and got rid of those. And while we still have some seedling things coming in here and there, for the most part, we do not have much in the way of invasive plants when it comes to woody invasives. We are still battling heavily Japanese honeysuckle vine and the Japanese stilt grass. So Owl's Nest Woods is about a third of an acre, in which was covered with the Japanese honeysuckle vine. And here you can see we had an option. We could have either sprayed it in the fall when a lot of the natives are asleep and dormant, and therefore being very selective to target the Japanese honeysuckle since it's semi-evergreen leaves. But we chose and we've been doing this more and more. We've been getting away from using chemicals as much as possible. Basically, we look at it as our last tool in the toolbox. If we can remove something mechanically, we will, as a first choice. So prior to us pulling up all this Japanese honeysuckle, there was maybe 12 bloodroots that we would see in the spring. The following spring, once we had removed the Japanese honeysuckle, we saw over 100 blooming plants. So here's my wife, Carrie, demonstrating how we do it. And she and an intern did most of this work over about a week's time, 3 to 5 days of time to clear that entire area. And so what she does is she takes a 10 by 10 plot, takes a leaf blower and blows all the leaves off to one side, starts at the thinnest edge of where the honeysuckle is, and finds where it's connected to the ground, and either pulls or trims the root below that root nodule that they often have, and then rolls the vine-like material on itself. So here she is trimming at the edge and continues to move from left to right across a 10 by 10 area. Once she gets to the edge, she will blow the leaves back onto the now exposed soil area and repeat that process in the next 10 by 10 area. Eventually you get to a point where you have dislodged all of the Japanese honeysuckle and it's rolled up in this large ball, and then you can pull it off and decide what you're going to do with it next. In our case, we let it just decompose in a large pile. We also have a lot of impacts from domestic animals, mostly feral or domesticated cats. Unfortunately, we see a lot of birds that are killed on the property, and all you see is a pile of feathers left. So we know that the cats are not only impacting local native bird populations, but also amphibians and other smaller wildlife. So, given all these impacts, we felt like we wanted to start making headway in healing this property and doing things on smaller scales. We're working full time on other people's properties, so we had to do things as efficiently and as quickly as we could with the time and resources that we had. So we're going to go through each one of these, but deer fencing was one of the initial things that we did, and then installed a wildflower meadow. We've worked with some of the other open areas to do volunteer meadow applications. We've increased and made aquatic habitats on the property. We've done a lot of restoration in the woodlands, shrublands, and hedgerows. When I bought the property, there were only 2 native shrubs on the property. There was black haw viburnums and just a few plants of gray dogwood, Fornis racemus. And one of our main themes for the entire property is to try and infiltrate as much stormwater that falls on the property right into the ground where it falls. So in the winter of 2014 and 15, I hired a company out of Western Pennsylvania to install the deer fence. I specifically requested that they do the work in the wintertime. And fortunately, this winter, we had snow cover and frozen soil, so we could do the work with the least amount of damage as possible. I also requested that the company track into the woods in one path and then backtrack out that same path so that they weren't continually moving in and out of the woods in different ways and impacting a larger area. I helped prepare some of the fencing. Where I could, I used black locust posts. The front side of the property, I did not want to see an 8-foot tall woven wire fence. So there's actually a system of fencing on the front where there's 2 fences close together. And I'll show you that in a different slide. I'm using a draw knife here to take the bark off the black locust posts. Here, if you look, this is the front. This is Cafferty Road, and this is a Tuacan Valley Park across the street. This is our little cottage, 1859 cottage. This is a split rail fence, and 6 feet in front of it is a electrified by a solar panel wire fence. I have found that in the wintertime, when there's snow cover, the deer have heavy coats on, they will actually push their way through the electric fence. So we've actually added wire to the back of this fence now as an additional measure to help keep them out. The reason why this works is deer are nervous about jumping into a narrow space and not having the room to jump into or out of that space. They could easily jump these 2 fences. They're only about 52 inches tall, but they don't because of that depth perception problem they have. We've incorporated special gates called kissing gates, and they are often used in sheep farming in Wales, England, and Scotland, where they are trying to have gates which people can move through, but animals cannot. And the reason how they work is it's a very tight, narrow space. I built this little model to kind of demonstrate. So how they're used is a person walks into this open triangle, pushes the gate past them, and goes around the edge of the gate and walks out the other side. If the gate is ever left open, it's not a problem because this space is so narrow, sheep, or in this case, a deer, cannot make that turn easily as a full-size animal. These are shorter. In this case, I made them taller so that, again, it would be difficult for deer to jump this space. And it's called a kissing gate because the post on the gate itself kisses the 2 sides to the enclosure. So here you can see spring of 2014, what the property looked like. This was August of this year. This is right at the back of the property where I do have the 8-foot tall woven wire fencing. This is the neighbor's property that has deer have access to. Here you can see some regrowth. Here we're standing inside my property and again looking into the neighbor, and mostly what you're seeing there is the Carex pennsylvanicum. And if you spin 180 degrees, now you're looking into my property. And when we first purchased this property, you could be standing here to approximately 230 feet from Cafferty Road, the road that goes along the front of our property, and you could easily see a car driving along the road. And now you can no longer do that because the trees, shrubs, and ground plane forest herbs have regrown. Here you can see the deer. There's a corridor outside the fence that they can use to go down through, and it certainly is looking at this lush little forest that it would like to have access to. Once we closed out the deer, these are some of the native plants that started to show up on their own. Starry campion, which is indicative of a oak hickory woods that's very dry. Scutellaria came in small patches. Indian pipes, our native Heuchera americana showed up, and a small area of early saxifrages, among many other more common native plants. As I was saying, we transitioned a lot of the open lawn areas into meadows, and so the main portion of the wet meadow is about 3/4 of an acre. It has very distinct seasons. Early summer, it's dominated by spiderwort and white baptisia. In midsummer, it moves into the ironweed and rudbeckias. The main plant you see in here is Rudbeckia subtomentosa, sweet black-eyed Susan. In the fall, it transitions to asters and mist flowers is really heavily present in the main meadow. And then in some of the back areas in the late fall, you have the white asters like calico aster. At the end, I'll show an aerial video of the whole property and what it looks like. These are some of the main characters in the meadow that's blooming all summer, have various portions of blooming all summer long. And some of the more interesting plants that came in later, that's the wonderful thing. This meadow has been in for 9 years now. And each year we will see oftentimes a new species coming in from the original seed mix. It took about 7 years for Culver's root to show up in the meadow. Scutellaria took a number of years before we saw that in the meadow. In the last 3 years, we just started to see white Joe Pye weed in the meadow. Also in the last 3 years, bottled gentian, which was in the seed mix, started to show up in small patches. And just last year, cream gentian and meadow beauty, Rexia, showed up for the first. Doesn't mean that they weren't there in the meadow previous years. It's just this is the first time we've had a chance to actually see them, and they're coming up in a number of quantities that we can see more readily. So this was the wet area that was seeded as a wildflower meadow. These two areas here and here in the yellow are the two volunteer meadows. So what we're doing is managing these areas with whatever plants were in there, let them grow and start culling out the non-native plants or the plants that are undesirable, and allowing the native plants to start to flourish in. So what you're seeing here is an erratic type meadow mowing program that's very short to the ground. In this case, there was Japanese stiltgrass in this area, so we were heavily mowing it towards the end of the season to prevent that from going to seed. These are some of the plants that were coming up, volunteering themselves in these meadows. Ironically, the white Joe Pye weed was one of the main things that showed up in the volunteer meadow. But we also had some of the green fringed orchids show up, and St. John's wort, and many, many other plants were volunteering themselves. A lot of goldenrods, penstemons, things like that. This is the back portion of the property, happens to be the wettest portion. And as you can see, it was mowed lawn except for where it just got so wet that they couldn't mow it on a regular basis. This is 1 or 2 years later, in which I dug the first pond area. And this is only about 2.5 feet deep. You can dig down to about 3.5, 4 feet, and you hit the hard shale layer, which is creating this perched water table. So the only way water is coming into this pond is either coming through the poor soil in the ground or slightly runoff from overground through the meadow areas that we've created. Here it is in the last couple of years, and remember, you would be standing here. You'd be standing here looking out over lawn, and now it's all filled in with a lot of native plants. So everything you see in this picture has either been planted or we allowed it to volunteer itself in this landscape. And the interesting thing is, over the past maybe 5, 6 years, is spring peepers have moved in to this pond. Wood frogs have moved in. No salamanders have shown up yet, and very few turtles. We've had maybe 1 or 2 snapping turtles show up, but mostly the turtles have not made their way to this type of pond. The neighbor does have a pond that is pretty large and probably has turtles in, but they haven't made it to our area yet. Sorry, my computer is not cooperating well, so it's hard for me to move the cursor around it. Also, in creating the pond area, I created a number of different pools of different depths so that they would hold water. They essentially are like vernal pools, and they hold water for certain amounts of time and then dry out completely. Therefore, they will never have fish. I also created this area, which is a bog garden, which does have a liner. The rest of these pool areas do not, and used a special soil mix to create this bog. I worked with Mark Highland from Organic Mechanics to come up with a soil mix that would be acidic enough to use for these bog plants. Here it is soon after it was finished. This log here is the barrier between the soils that are in the pond liner area of the bog to the natural pond that's beyond, or the created natural looking pond beyond it. When this pond fills up, it'll overflow into the bog. In the woodland areas where we've been working at restoring the plants, particularly the healing woods, basically our technique here is to allow the things that are volunteering themselves to come in and flourish. We are not doing a lot of planting in healing woods. We're letting nature take its course. There are a series of path systems through it, but when branches or things fall on the path and they get put in piles, and initially these brush piles were very important because we had no real low ground level or shrub level vegetation on the property. So there was no place for birds to hide in the woods. They either had to be in the canopy of the trees or on the ground, and they were pretty exposed. So brush piles initially in the woods, even if this is invasive plant brush, does provide a good habitat, microhabitat within your woodlands. Here you can see how rocky it is in the woods. And wherever trees are falling, we are just allowing them to decompose and help rejuvenate our forest soils. Here on the edge of the property where the soils are very poor, whenever I've had firewood that has gone beyond its purpose of being good firewood, or if there's brush been coming off project sites that is punky and somewhat rotted, we've been adding it to create these kind of decay stations where we again are letting the woody material decompose over time and help build the forest soils. It's also very important that we're protecting the microhabitats of microtopography within this forested area. Much of our landscapes in southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, we've graded these landscapes. Once the woodlands were taken away for farmland or for development. So there's very little areas of our land that has these little pocketed areas, and that's what a natural woodlands would have. When a tree comes down in a storm, if it was a healthy tree, it'll pull up a large pile of soil with its root mass and create a pit on the other side of that. These pits are basically the way a forest rototills the soil over thousands of years in these little micro pockets. And what you have happen is the pocket itself gets filled with leaves and starts to build up a much rich soil on it. The mounds themselves are dry and rocky, and so other types of species like black birch and sumac trees get started on those mounded areas where they prefer that type of habitat and soil condition. The dead ash trees, in many areas, we did not take them all the way to the ground. We actually used that spider lift to cut them up 10, 15 feet off the ground. And what's happening is the pileated woodpeckers and other types of wildlife are starting to use these as wildlife snags. It was important to us that we preserved as much of those as we could. No vegetation leaves the property. Everything is recycled, whether it's run through a chipper with the woody stuff or anything, any lawn areas that I do have, I will mow it in the fall with this mulching bag, and it grinds it up, and I then put it back on the bed areas or just blow the leaves into the forested areas. And any other types of weeds that we're pulling just goes in a compost pile, which we'll reutilize over time. We've created a bunch of pollinator areas on the site, whether creating these like pollinator hotels, or my wife came up with this wonderful idea of using some of our leftover fence posts. We take canes of briars or sumac or elderberry, which has a soft center or a hollow pith, and many of your native solitary bees will use these to create homes in chambers for their larvae to grow. And so this is a wonderful way to reutilize those materials. As I was saying, there are a few hedgerows on the property, as demonstrated by these purple lines. They were dominated by ash trees predominantly. So we've lost a lot of the canopy in these hedgerows. So we've worked at replanting trees within these hedgerows to eventually have a new canopy in the hedgerow, as well as a lot of native shrubs. Hedgerows provide a lot of functions that benefit habitats ecologically, and here you can see they create habitat. They can be filters. They can be a sink in which runoff then gets trapped within a hedgerow and is allowed to infiltrate. They can be a source for allowing adjacent part of the land to regenerate and succeed from an old field into a forest again someday. And they can also be a conduit where wildlife moves along these hedgerows where they can't be out in open spaces like a lawn or an agricultural field. So now I'll show you some projects that we've done to better infiltrate water on the property. Here, this is a before shot. The backside of the house. This new area of infiltration that you'll see in the next few slides is taking all the water from the backside of the house and putting it in the ground in this ephemeral pool. And also the sump pump in the basement is put into this pool. So here I am starting to excavate out the soils. To minimize my impact, I basically worked from the farthest end of the pool to the nearest end where we would exit the machine out. I used the excess soils to create a pathway system along the edge that would be higher and drier to use to walk on later on. And I would swing the bucket from the exit area either to where I was replacing the soil, or if I was taking it away, I would swing it right to the bucket of my tractor. And again, we had a one way in, one way out system. So we were doing the least amount of impact compaction of soils as possible. And here you can see soon after the grading was done and a few plantings were put in, how wet this area is. This is the seeded wildflower meadow, that is the moist meadow. And here's a series of pools that are connected one to another, and eventually it exits out the property underneath the culvert, underneath the road into the park. So here we are soon after construction. Here's a year or two later, once plants have started to fill in. I'm one of the few landscape architects that plant a lot of dead trees. So these are dead snags that I've actually secured into the ground. Here's a number of them over here. They're great for wildlife to perch on, whether it's a dragonfly or flycatcher or hawk, whatever. They have places that are structural members in the landscape that look natural for them to utilize. We also have a shed that has a green roof on, and I worked with Rachel and Jared from Wild Ridge Plants to collect seed for me and grow plants that are native woodland plants that can tolerate very thin soils. So you see a lot of columbine here and Appalachian sedge, two-leaf cynthia, and our native sedum ternatum are the main plants in this. There's only 4 inches of soil medium in this green roof. And I did not water at all, even during last year's drought, and those plants are doing quite well. Here's the list of all the plants that were used, and certainly some of them did not survive long term, but many of them did. So my goal was to use, create a green roof, which oftentimes commercial sized green roofs use almost no native plants on them. I wanted my green roof to be all native plants. Here's another stormwater infiltration project. The field to the left of the screen over here is a very wet field, but I have to use it to store materials on and turn my tractor around or deliver plant materials that are going to a project site. So in an attempt to dry that field a little sooner in the spring, this area was dished out as a bioswale. So this is before the work was done. And here we are again, using the machines together to do as little impact as possible. Where I could, I was preserving native plants that had already shown up in that field. So we kind of dug the depression around them. And here it is soon after the grading is done. And so this is a series of, again, pool areas that are connected. And here you use some big rocks to actually go from the meadow path across the bioswale and over to the flat lawn area. And a day after we had finished the grading, here's that Joe Pye weed that was preserved from before. And these trees were here before. We got 2 inches of rain. You can see that it starts up here and flows its way down through here, goes through the pipe and on to the next pool area. And it worked quite well, and it continues to work quite well. Here it is a few years later, all starting to fill in with the native plants. So I just wanted to thank, I've been working with Ben Floyd and also Gene Huntington, who are both have separate businesses, but they use drones quite a bit in their businesses. And Ben, in particular, for the last 6-7 years, I've had him fly my meadow, and so that I can get a kind of sense of how the meadow is changing over the last few years, with changes in species coming and going. And he's done a really wonderful job, and I will show you next a video that he took. But Gene has also done a lot of the slides, aerial photos that was used in this presentation. And I'll leave you with one other thing. Here's a little homework for you. This story by Joseph Sindelaire, Father Thrift and His Animal Friends. He's got a chapter in here called, I can't read it because it's behind my, Trouble in the Forest. This book was copyrighted in 1918, but I think this children's story, and it applies to adults equally well, is really indicative of the trouble that we're in our times, and we need to do things better than what we've been doing over the last 100 years or so. And there's many ways we can do it on a lot of different properties, on small scales and larger scales. And I hope that this presentation gives you an idea that, you don't have to have 20 or 30 acres to make a difference. You can have just an acre or a quarter of an acre to do something really wonderful and bring wildlife back into your landscape. So let me show you the video so you can kind of get a sense of the whole property. This was taken in August of this year, and our meadow basically has this level of flower display from about July 25th through September 10th. You look quickly, there's a hummingbird shows up on this branch. So I hope you all enjoyed this presentation, and the video kind of gives you a sense of the feel of the property. It's peak bloom in the meadow. And I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much. What an incredible project. I actually have, I'm going to ask the first question. I was
Sure.
curious with you and Carrie, did you guys have a similar vision for the property, or I'm just curious if you had to
Uh,
rock paper scissor at all for any of the
yeah, we've
different
definitely had to do
attributes?
some of that. I mean, I met Carrie in 2017, so 3 years after I had purchased the property.
Oh, okay.
We are going to be moving to that property eventually. We're not living there currently because the house needs to be reworked, as I was telling you earlier. But yeah, we've had some back and forth, and she brings ideas to it, and then we incorporate some of those. And I, have had a vision for the property. Haven't really done a plan of the property because a lot of it was kind of experiential and working through, what's going on here, what do we need to change, what's the impact here, how can we make this better, and then start to progress with that. And things are just kind of habitat linked from one to the next throughout the property.
Awesome. So one person wants to know, how many acres in total was it that you restored?
It's 4.3 acres is the total size of the property, and almost all of that's within the deer fence. There's just a little portion out along the road that's not.
Okay, wonderful. There's another question about what material do you use for your paths?
So there are different materials used in different places. In the healing woods, I had a friend contractor, you may know him, Herman Moser, land stewards. He had a project where a client had a lot of red tipple gravel in their planting beds. That was the theme of the gardens of someone passed, and so the new owner hated all the red tipple everywhere, and it's really not great for growing most plants in. So they were removing it from that site. So I asked him if I could have those materials, and I used a small machine that can carry up to 600 pounds. It's basically an automated wheelbarrow, and created the paths through putting down gravel in a very narrow 30-inch width path through the woods. So basically cleared away the leaves, took out some of the rocks that were sticking up, and then put down the gravel to make the paths in Healing Woods. Other areas have wood chip paths, which are easier to make, but they don't last as long. About every 2 years, the wood chips degrade enough that it's not as easy to walk on them. So what we do is we take spring rakes and feather the wood chips that were on the path out into the adjacent landscape area and let them just continue to degrade, and then put down a fresh layer of wood chips in those areas. And then the final type of path is basically the mowed lawn in some areas as well.
Gotcha. Great. Someone asked, do you mow your meadows periodically?
So they do get mowed once a year. If I didn't, the trees would start to fill in. But we rotationally mow them, so not every portion of the property gets mowed every year. It's basically by a third of the main meadow gets mowed, left up, and the other 2/3 get mowed. And then we will rotate that area each year so that by the third year, everywhere has been mowed. And the reason why is we want to leave some habitat over winter and some, seed sources for birds to eat, as well as places for the pollinators to overwinter. And then we, move that habitat areas all around where the meadows are.
Would you ever be able to burn the meadows on your property? Is that sanctioned in your township?
I don't believe they would allow it in our township. I do someday want to do a little experimental burning in the woods because our oak hickory woods, the Native Americans would have actually burned periodically to improve hunting ability and to improve some nut and berry production. I'm trying to reestablish low bush blueberry on my site, which is difficult to do. And at some point, once it's healthy enough, I would like to burn those patches to try to keep them embiggered.
This question is, what was the source of the seed mix you used for establishing the sowed meadow? And part 2 is, some of the plants took years to be apparent. Is that to be expected?
So I'll answer the second question first. Yes, it is to be expected that plants will show up kind of in their own time frame as you allow the meadow to develop. Some of them just take longer to germinate from seed. Some of them are waiting for the right year and the right circumstances to be able to really take off and grow. The seed mix itself, I designed especially for this site, knowing how wet the soils are, knowing that it was slightly acidic. And then I sent the seed mix off to Prairie Moon Nursery, which is a Midwestern seed source. And probably also got some seed from Prairie Nursery and Ernst, and mixed them all together myself and did a dormant seeding in the winter of 2015.
Great.
Yeah. I think the other one to say also, sorry to cut you off.
It's okay.
Think of meadows just like a forest where, a forest takes 100 years to evolve and mature, when you get trees that start to become 12 inches in diameter. Well, a meadow takes a number of years to mature as well, usually 2, 3, 4 years to mature. And yet, even after it's maturing, it's still going to evolve and change as different, things happen. Like, for example, last year we had one of the worst droughts we've had in probably over 200 years. And while many of the species in that meadow did not blink, there were a few species didn't show up last year just because of that change. And now I would expect in this next year, since we also had a dry fall this year, that there may be maybe one or two new species start to show up that I haven't seen before, and some species may go by the wayside because it just wasn't enough to survive that drought.
Very true. Yes. Last summer fall was a rough one. I was just going to ask because I know, obviously you're a registered landscape architect. You're able to, I'm sure, get things from nurseries and whatnot who are wholesale, maybe not retail for the average homeowner. So I was going to ask some of the resources that you did say, like Prairie Moon, Ernst, Prairie Seed, and even Wild Ridge Plants with Jared and Rachel. Are those sources that homeowners, and do they do retail as well as wholesale?
Definitely Prairie Nursery and Prairie Moon do retail.
Okay.
Jared and Rachel actually are a retail nursery.
Oh, great.
I'm not sure about Ernst if they are only wholesale or not.
Okay.
That one I'm not sure of. But there are a number, thankfully, of native plant nurseries in our Philadelphia region. There's Redbud Native Plant Nursery down by Media, Pennsylvania. There is Edge of the Woods up in Allentown area, Pennsylvania. There is Tino's Landscape Nursery in Wrightstown, Pennsylvania, which is not far from me here in Doylestown. So there's a number of native plant nurseries. And thankfully, there are some mainstream nurseries that are starting to carry a lot more natives. The one caution I would say about nurseries that don't focus only on natives is you will get likely some misinformation about what's native and what's not. And that can be a problem because I've had many clients come to me and say, oh, yeah, they told me it was native. And I'm like, actually, that's the Japanese form of the native, and that's going to be a problem for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I will put a little plug in for Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. We do have a garden shop. Our outdoor nursery is still open. So if anyone's looking to do some kind of end of fall planting, we still have perennials and shrubs and trees left to go. So come and visit us as well.
Yeah, and fall is a great time of the year to get plants in the ground and get them established.
Wonderful. I'm also I took some notes, David. I'm curious how I love that you plant dead trees in the garden. I also love that you kept a lot of the ashes for snags, but that going that extra step of commitment to making sure that you have dead trees and snags in the garden. How do you secure them into the ground?
Sure. Yeah. So let's back up one portion and what makes the best material for a snag. Basically, you want to try and pick wood species that are more rot resistant.
Okay.
And I have familiarity with that because I make furniture, outdoor rustic furniture. And so I'm always looking for what are the best species to use in that type of application. But you can transfer that type of information to a snag. So some of the most rot resistant native wood materials, black locust is one of the best. The U.S. Forest Service has done studies of fence posts, and they've dated some as old as 70 years that were still in the ground and intact. So that is, 3 times better than a pressure treated post lifespan. Other good woods are Osage orange. The invasive plant white mulberry is highly rot resistant. If you don't have access to any of those, a lot of my snags are actually sassafras trees, which is lighter weight wood, but does have a reasonable amount of rot resistancy to them. And they make really great snags because since the wood is a lighter weight wood, it's easier for small mammals and birds to excavate out cavities in them. And I find frequently when you see cavities in sassafras trees, they are inhabited by flying squirrels.
Hmm.
That seems to be one of their favorite species to use for cavity nesting. Um, White oak is also somewhat rot resistant and can be used. And to secure them into the ground, basically I'm digging a hole that is down to or below the frost line. So for us, that they used to say it was 3 feet down. I would say it's less than that now, but at least get your hole down to about 30 inches. You can fill it then with clean gravel. Um, put your post in and fill it with clean gravel and tamp it as you go down. Um, that it's really tight in the hole, and that is going to give you good drainage around the post so that it or the snag so that it stays longer for you in the ground. And as it starts to rot and loosen up in the hole, you can always add more gravel and tamp it down so that you get more years out of it.
Hmm.
The other main species that's really good too is eastern red cedar. That's also somewhat rot resistant.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. A question came up back about reseeding or seeding your meadow. When you created it, did you simply overseed the existing lawn with your seed mix, or did you attempt to pull up the grass? And did you seed more than once, or was it just the one time?
It was only seeded once. So in order to get a lot of the native wildflowers established, you have to eliminate the vegetative cover that's there. They don't, as little seedlings, have the capacity to outcompete, particularly in lawn grasses that are runners, that have underground root systems that spread by runners. That was the one of the few cases where we did use herbicides. We had hired an expert to come in and spray Roundup on that lawn area. It was a one-time spray, so I minimized what I had to do, and I was done in the fall when you can use the least amount of herbicide and get the maximum amount of benefit. And then seeded in the late fall, early winter, through or on top of the residual part of the lawn, and raked it in, and then let winter's process of the freeze thaw cycle to mix the seed into the ground. And it's been growing like that since 2015. And the first few years, it does not look like a wonderful wildflower meadow. There's very little blooming in the first year or two. It's that first year or two, they're spending more time getting roots into the ground than they are above ground growth. So oftentimes they look kind of weedy. And you have to manage the annual weeds that are naturally in your soil seed bank by cutting them before they go to seed, but not cutting your meadow so low that you're harming those little native plants that you're germinating. And then after those first few initial years, then you're just mowing it once a year at the end of the year. Usually March, early March is when I'm mowing it. And it's just a walk behind brush cutting machine that I use to mow it at that point.
Okay. Thank you for that.
You do have to get rid of the initial vegetation that's there. You can't just seed through lawn or old agricultural field. It's a special process.
Awesome. All right. Anyone else out there have last questions for David? If not, I might throw this one out to you. I'm hoping that those who join us tonight are inspired by what you have done on your property. And do you have any advice for homeowners who are inspired and want to kind of get started with a project on their property? Kind of maybe some words of wisdom about where they might be able to start.
Well, yes. So ecologists and restoration specialists, they usually start on a project or a site where the healthiest native plant material is, and get rid of whatever few invasives are in that area and work their way out to the worst areas of the site. That's the best way to handle dealing with transitioning a site from native plants or from a disturbed landscape that has some native plants and some non-native plants, problematic plants, to getting it to be more healthy native plant community. So you work from your best area to your worst area. I would say start small, do small areas like we were doing with the Japanese honeysuckle. If we only had time to do a 10 by 10 area, that's fine. And then move on when you have more time, to a larger area or continue that process. And really what we're doing on this property is meant to be done anywhere, so that, regardless of whether you have a small front yard area to deal with or a 10-acre property, you should be able to take these techniques and either scale them up or down depending on the size and complexity of the site you're working with. And then when you get stuck, then it's time to call in a professional who has had more experience and knows what to do in certain situations to get you through to where you want to go. And the beauty of all this is, once you start making these changes, you really see a lot of things start to come in and use your landscape. So for the first time last winter, we saw a mink show up at our pond in the back, and it was fishing for frogs late winter. So it's really great to see some wildlife that's a little less common start to come back into an area that it may not have been in for a while, and it has a place to actually really thrive.
That's so cool. I know I saw that you had installed a wildlife camera. Did I see that correctly on one of the slides? Have you seen anything other than those? I'm assuming those house cat pictures might have been from your wildlife camera. Yeah.
Yeah, they were from the wildlife camera. We have a family of fox that are on the property, very distinctive female fox from the male fox, and they show up regularly, and they're in all different parts of the property. We've got a healthy community of opossum, and we've got raccoons. The only thing we really don't have is deer and bear because they're outside the fence.
Yeah.
But everything else is, essentially making its way through. We haven't seen any wild turkey yet, but they're in our area. It's just, it'll have to be the right time and place to see.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much for sharing all this amazing information with us and being on tonight with our Jenkins audience. So it was nice to reconnect with you. And again, thank you for sharing all this information with our group. And thanks to everyone who's still out there listening to our questions. And David didn't even know it, but that was a great transition to our third Thursday lecture for next month. For November, we're actually going to feature wild turkeys. So if you want to learn more, you can sign up for our next lecture. All right. Well, David, take care. Thank you again for being with us.
Yep. Take care.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.